welcome to a special edition of the European and Eurasian Studies seminar series. One of the things that we've been trying to do in the European and Eurasian Studies program is to get a better sense of how politics works, who has power, how power is exercised. And in doing so, what we've been trying to do is to move away from static models that assume that we can organize people either on some kind of one-dimensional left-right scale or according to class distinctions. Even institutional arrangements become fairly challenging. The problem is coming up with a mode of analysis that's going to allow us to do that, to understand politics and power and the way that it interacts with a kind of micro understanding of how societies are put together. That's a challenge that we've been finding very difficult to do in Western Europe. It's even more challenging to do in Central and Eastern Europe. And so we're very fortunate today to have a scholar who's managed to go and study hundreds of oligarchs in Russia and Ukraine in order to understand both what they want and how they try to achieve their goals using different kinds of power relations in order to influence politics or, when necessary, to escape from the political arena. Now, you got to have a certain kind of courage to go into Ukraine and Russia in order to study that thing. And so we're very fortunate that our scholar today is one who not only comes from the region, but ended up doing his high school in Germany, his university at the University of Pennsylvania, where he graduated summa cum laude, his graduate degree with Torben Iversen at Harvard, which must have been one of the more terrifying experiences that you could undergo, and then went out to the University of Chicago, where he was assistant professor before becoming a tenured associate professor at the Booth School, or the Moore School of Business at the University of South Carolina. I hope you guys will join me in welcoming. He's a prize-winning author whose articles have been recognized by the American Political Science Association, and whose book, first book, the book on which this talk is based, if I'm not mistaken, won the prize of the American Political Science, or American Political...
Actually, International Social Science Council,
yeah.
The Stein-Roken.
The Stein-Roken Prize. So please join me in welcoming Professor Stanislav Marcus.
Eric, thank you very much for the generous introduction. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks to everybody for being here today. Thank you also for our viewers who are not here today. Thank you for taking time to watch. I'll try to be, I'm kidding, I will not be addressing the camera. But let me first just give you a very brief overview of my two research projects. Basically, my first book project is about the political economy of property security, right? How does property become secure? And the second large project is about the political economy of extreme wealth stratification, specifically material power, and how it is manifested politically. Because we only have half hour, I will focus on this first project today, but I do have the slides for the second one too. So if during Q&A you want me to go more into the oligarchs, we can do that, right? So today most of the talk will be on how property rights become secure in Russia and Ukraine for medium-sized to large firms, but not necessarily for the oligarchs, right? So the oligarchs we can elaborate on a bit later. So just a few fundamental definitional things. Property rights are commonly defined as the rights to derive income from an asset, to manage an asset, and to transfer its ownership, and the dependent variable is the security of property rights. Now, if you don't believe in magic, you should read the literature on the consequences of secure property rights. It seems that all of the things that political economists care about, from political liberties to economic development to firm profitability, they all flow from secure property rights. But our understanding of the consequences of secure property rights is much better than our understanding of the causes, right? And this issue of the causes, it in turn implies two distinct questions. First, what threatens property rights, and second, what makes them secure. So my answers to these questions, as Eric mentioned, have been published as a book. Some images are not showing up, I don't know why, but and the book basically makes three arguments. Okay, the first argument is that the conventional diagnosis of what makes property rights insecure is incomplete because it ignores low-level state actors. right, the first argument. The second argument is that the conventional solution to insecure ownership fails in the context of disorganized, low-level threats by state actors. And the third argument is that the novel solution to insecure property rights involves firm-level strategies rather than macro-institutional design. So this is just a brief overview. Next, I will briefly mention the types of data that have led me to those answers. Then we'll go through the theoretical framework, some cases, and at the end, some survey evidence. So this is the map for the next 25 minutes. All right, in terms of the data. So first, I have conducted quite a few interviews, 152 semi-structured interviews in the region, spanning a period of 10 years. The breakdown of my qualitative sample is on top. In the process of doing these interviews, I was offered jobs by a Russian corporate security agency, as well as a Ukrainian gangster. So if today's job talk doesn't pan out, those are my backups. Oh yeah, then I also have tenure. Actually, I'm okay. But I have also implemented a large-end survey of enterprises in the region through two most reputable business survey organizations. The survey, unfortunately, is only one slice of the panel, so it's not longitudinal data, which introduces some challenges we can talk about later. It is regionally representative. It is restricted on size and sector, mostly focusing on manufacturing firms that are medium to large size. So this is very briefly on the data side. So, okay, conventional wisdom. So what do we know about what threatens property rights, right? The first big question. Well, the literature tells us that outside of the failed states, right, it's really dominant rulers that present the main threat to property rights. So think about people like Vladimir Putin, right? So that would be something on this front. And in terms of solutions to this ruler dominance, so basically the literature really has the propensity to emphasize the sovereign with a capital S, right, an organized system. And in terms of solutions, the orthodoxy tells us that reputational self-restraint by the ruler is not enough, right? What we need instead are institutional constraints on the ruler's discretion. In other words, we're talking about checks and balances, right? Be it federalism, independent judiciary, independent parliament, and so forth. So this is very briefly conventional wisdom. Okay, good, it's working. Now, there are quite a few empirical anomalies that clash with this conventional wisdom, right? The first anomaly is that if threats to property rights are really driven by the ruler, how can we explain the fact that state predation often undermines the ruler's top priorities, right? So in the book, I go through some of Vladimir Putin's priorities in the last 15 years, and I show how state predation has undermined almost all of them, sometimes in critical ways. So I don't have time to go through each of them here now, but let me mention a few interesting ones. So say defense contracts with Jordan, right? So basically solidifying Russia's defense industry definitely has been one of Putin's priorities. At some point, Putin personally negotiated a contract, a large defense contract with the king of Jordan. And then on the Russian side, the factory that was producing the arms was raided by state actors. In other words, there were illegal assaults on its property by regional state actors. The Jordanians got wind of that and they pulled out last minute, and Putin was embarrassed. Right? This is just a very quick example of these anomalies where things happen that don't quite fit the conventional story of all problems stem from the ruler, right? Or they are organized by the ruler or controlled by the ruler. This is an interesting one, effective electoral manipulation. So we all know that one of Putin's priorities has been to remain in power or to control power, perhaps indirectly. So during the last Duma elections, right, that were definitely partly manipulated by the state, the story that we didn't hear as much was that a lot of the funds that the Kremlin allocated to United Russia were stolen by United Russia employees, in other words, by state employees at the local levels. So the fact that the Duma, that Putin barely got the majority he wanted, but very barely, it was in fact a very embarrassing result, right? And that triggered, if you remember, large protests in Moscow in 2011, right? And Putin was quite enraged. So it also has to do with this low-level predation that I emphasize in the book and that I examine. So the first big critique is that state threats to property rights critique of the orthodoxy that is often outside of the upper executive's control. Okay. The second anomaly that I draw attention to concerns the ineffectiveness of institutional constraints on the upper executive. Let's think about Ukraine for a second. Oof. It's not showing the images.
Could you define for us what exactly you mean by upper executive in this context? Is it simply Putin, or are there others?
Absolutely. Let me just I will remember the question, but on the technical side, is there, Eric, so it's actually not showing critical images.
Not sure what we need to do to fix that, unfortunately.
Do you want to see if that will do a
Should
better
we?
job?
Yeah, that's actually good. Yeah,
That
let's do
might
that.
be the
Yes.
better way to show
Okay.
maybe the laptop is not doing it.
Is it easy to switch back to that?
Should
Did
be.
he leave? Yeah, I think it might be just a matter of changing the input.
Okay.
I've had the same issues.
I did too.
So it's not me. That's good. That's good to know.
No, it's
I
very
was worried.
frustrating. I've seen issues.
Yeah, I was in this room too, I remember.
Yeah.
But are the slides?
I mean, I like charades. I could try to do graphs. if you
You
want.
got this strange sound effects
Are your
going on
slides
in the
Yeah,
background. I don't
Stan?
know.
Stan,
Are
are
your
your
slides
slides
here?
here?
Okay.
That's why that memory stick is
Yes.
semantic.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I can do with it is jump back and forth between the end of the presentation. But anyway,
Do
well,
you want to take
that's this one's nice.
this one?
Yeah. This one. There. All right. Still not showing. Yeah, it's not showing images.
Would you prefer to use your USB?
No,
We are
we're
using
using
it.
it.
Yeah.
I wonder why wouldn't we show the images?
Save a PDF maybe and use the PDF?
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
We're having trouble getting it to show images. It says image part with relationship ID was not found in the file. Were the images saved in the file?
Were they links?
No, they're images. I mean, you can see them here. See the book image, the graphs, so you can see them, but not in the presentation. See how this part is not shown here. Yeah. It is.
She had a great idea. Could you want to just make it into a PDF and then flash the PDF as a slideshow instead?
The only thing is that it's not gonna be dynamic, it's
It
not gonna be
won't be.
moving.
I have
Correct.
animations.
But at
I
least
do
you'll
have
have
a
all the
dynamic.
images on.
Well, whatever you guys think is best. I can talk more about the slides. I mean,
They're there.
No.
No, that wasn't
No?
on earlier slide.
Oh, okay.
So this was, yeah, this is showing for some reason, but not the JPG files that I
Uh-huh.
have. But usually this is the first time in a long time that's ever.
So the
It's all
JPEGs
your
are shown up.
critical thinking skills on your feet.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, there is just a small group of us.
I was
Why don't
thinking
you
just
sit here on
turn
your
the- yeah,
laptop and
exactly.
you leave your laptop.
I can hold it up like a boombox.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe.
Walk around.
Why?
You sitting closer so you can see if I good.
Yeah, no, I
really good idea.
He might not want us to sell them.
And when we talked about this before, you said you had the slides, you had the backup slides, and you had a third version. Do we have a third version?
I mean, this is it. This is on the laptop and on the flash drive.
And here you can see the images. They're just not
It's
projecting.
weird. See, here you can see it, but here now it's not showing this. But see how you can see it here? Hold on a second. Let me try. Okay, let me try do something else. Yeah.
Sounds like it's a common using the switching from on a PC to smart classroom.
Okay, well, I guess we'll have to do without it. Oh, you're trying something else?
So
Go ahead.
when did you save the pictures?
They,
Yeah.
they, in
We
this,
can't replace it.
Yeah.
So like this is like image was not found in the file.
yeah, hold on a second.
Associate Dean Lewis, what's going on?
All ding technology.
Let's try this one. Let's go back to this guy.
Using government. I requested my friend who was standing in the jury chance to give you some names.
We should change the source.
So, I gave her a bunch of names and I said, I don't
We might have the solution.
Wow.
We officially have the solution.
Well done.
There better be points.
So you're not the go-to guy for all of us, yeah?
Technology is not my strong suit, obviously.
There we go.
Okay,
Once in a
All right.
while, it's feeling.
good. All right, so we're back to the idea of what's the second anomaly with conventional wisdom. I will go a little faster so that we catch up without missing anything critical. Okay, the second anomaly is that institutional constraints on the state sovereign often don't work to control predation by low-level bureaucrats. A good example here is Ukraine during the Orange Revolution. So in 2004, Ukraine achieved a pretty significant democratic breakthrough with the institutionalization of an independent parliament. According to the literature, that really should have protected property rights better in the aftermath, right? Once you get the wealth holders power in the parliament. If you think about classical literature extrapolating from British history. And what we saw in Ukraine is that political freedoms actually went up, but economic freedoms and property rights protections either stayed stagnant or went down after the Orange Revolution. So this is just, again, something to alert us to the fact that conventional wisdom might not be right. In my own surveys, entrepreneurs often judge the incorruptibility of local state agents to be more important than the democratic control of national governments as far as property rights protection goes. These are statistically significant differences for both countries. So the second big anomaly I note is that the limits on the upper executive are insufficient to secure property rights. And this brings me to your question about what the upper, see, it was all planned. I was like, yeah. What the upper executive constitutes. So what I criticize here is the view of the sovereign, which can mean two things in the literature. The first thing is that, yes, it's actually Moscow or Kiev, right, the ruler who personally controls expropriation, predation, corruption, basically. Unless he gets a cut, he shuts it down, something like that. But the second way in which the literature conceives of the sovereign is this maximization logic. The state functions as if it always maximizes taxes and investment, right, the systemic logic of maximization. So both of those views I criticize as insufficient given the evidence we have. All right, the third anomaly I note is that threats to property rights vary from firm to firm, even when the firms are located in the same region. This should strike us as pretty anomalous given that the literature treats property rights security as a nation-level variable, right? So very quick examples here from my surveys. So these are two regions in Russia and Ukraine, and as you can see, threats to property rights within those regions vary widely across firms. Why would that be the case, right? If it's all about Moscow and Russia as a whole and Ukraine as a whole, why would there be this firm-to-firm variation? So the third basic critique I raise is that firms might not just be policy takers, they might be able to secure property rights more directly. So taking that and moving further with it, the literature starts from this conception of a small, vulnerable, atomistic firm faced with a big, scary state. Right? The first intervention I make is I note that often predation occurs at the local level by state agents that do not have the administrative sanction of the sovereign. Right? And second, firms are not really atomistic, right? They have a variety of stakeholders, including labor, adjacent communities, different types of foreigners, say investors, NGOs, IGOs, foreign media. And the basic argument is that these stakeholders can counteract state threats by imposing different types of costs, right, on the state. Now, two questions still require an answer here, right? Basically, first, why would the stakeholders care to intervene on behalf of the firm owners, right? And second, how exactly do the stakeholders impose those different types of costs? So my answer to the first question points to the fact that the stakeholders often lose specific benefit streams associated with the firm, if the firm is expropriated, for example. And those benefit streams, they can be related to this thing we call corporate social responsibility. So let's say if the firm provides housing for the region, right? If the firm does some sort of charity and really important work, and that firm is under threat, the beneficiaries of that corporate social responsibilities know that suddenly their benefits are up in the air, right? And they might lose them. So that's kind of the basic logic. Also think about foreign investors that often benefit from firm transparency, right? Or from specific provisions that allow them, say, veto votes on the board, right? Anything along those lines. They also would lose those benefits, or at least there is a pretty serious risk of losing these benefits if the firm is expropriated. So this is on the issue of incentivizing the stakeholders. The second question is, well, what exactly can they do? Fine, they care about the future of the firm. What can the stakeholders do to actually protect it? So in my work, I go through four specific mechanisms, right? And there are many cases in the book that highlight these mechanisms. Here, I will be a little brief. The first mechanism is financial. The basic idea is that the stakeholders can, so this is, for example, the Expo case in Russia. So here the idea is that stakeholders can make it more expensive for the state to move against the firm. So this is a mid-sized manufacturing firm in Saratov, Russia, and it was lucky to have a US investor. So at the time it was targeted by local state officials. The investor convened a roundtable on the local investment climate. So it had a lot of US kind of corporate heavyweights in attendance, so think Marriott, Coca-Cola, GM, and so forth. And following that roundtable, the investors basically pledged to withdraw completely from the region, right, the investment. And that's what changed the calculus of the local state officials. What's nice about that case is that there were several other expropriation targets in the region for the local state that were very similar to Expo case, except for this issue of stakeholder alliances. And all of those other targets were actually fully expropriated, right? In other words, the owners illegally lost their control over equity. Expo survived. I used several other cases. I will not mention Moskva here. Yukos, I have separate slides on Yukos, but Yukos is a very interesting case that warrants a second look, right? We tend to think of Yukos as this major failure for private owners and a victory for Putin. But the case is actually much more complicated thanks to Yukos's stakeholder alliances. And again, I have separate slides on Yukos, and we will come back to that. All right, the second mechanism, political costs. So here what the stakeholders can do, they can lobby behind the scenes, or they can also organize let's say, protests on the streets, right? So it's either about this bottom-up protests or it's about the top-level lobbying behind the scenes usually. So politically, they restrict the menu of feasible options for state actors. Here I have a quote from my interview with the Ukrainian advisor to the Prime Minister. Firms with a foreign stake are better protected than pure natives. We have the US ambassador running to the cabinet of ministers based on any trifle, screaming an American investor was hurt. Americans lobby hard. It can be annoying, really, but it works. Germans also create a fuss. The ambassador is, of course, calmer, but they have Frau Rau, who's the permanent delegate of German business. So that's kind of the idea here. When it comes to framing, framing is basically about public relations, which are very important when it comes to local expropriation that's not sanctioned by the center, right? How is the conflict portrayed in the media? What is the publicity? Do people think of the owners as, basically illegitimate owners in the first place, so they deserve to have their property taken away, or do they think of them as responsible, local corporates who need to be protected against greedy bureaucrats, right? That's where stakeholder alliances are pretty central. Here I have a case study of a shop in Moscow, Muvakal. This was a shop that a lot of its customer base were World War II veterans, right? And when the crisis hit, basically they were pressured by the FSB, which is a pretty fearsome, it's basically the intelligence agency, secret service agency in Russia, so they were pressured to give up their equity. They activated their customer base, right? These old people, World War II veterans, who knew they would basically lose their access to cheap produce and so forth. So they started swamping the media with letters of complaints, and ultimately the conflict was portrayed as if FSB was attacking the World War II legacy itself of Russia, right? This is like motherland is in danger, basically, kind of articles, right? So they shut down the scheme pretty fast because it was clear with all the spotlight there was no way to success. Physical costs, that's the most extreme way. So this is when everything else fails. This is a measure of last resort. And you have a police unit that basically shows up at the premises of your enterprise, right? And they're ready to take over. The labor that's on the premises has a choice. They can just let it happen, or they can form a human fence around the enterprise, basically forcing law enforcement into an actual physical conflict, which again triggers the publicity mechanism, right? There are some fascinating cases here. One of my favorites is Tavria. This is in Crimea, Ukraine. So this is around 1,000 workers fought with basically 100 commandos through a night of skirmishes, and the workers pulled up their tractors to the factory. So it was pretty intense. It was a cognac factory, maybe that played into that. That I do not know, but basically it very quickly attracted the attention of the Minister for the Interior in Ukraine, and the enterprise survived. This is my interview with the head of a corporate conflict agency in Russia. By far not every armed detachment will want to fight with a crowd of workers in front of cameras. But you have to establish a relationship with your employees in advance. You cannot just get them to go out there for you on ready, set, go. Right? Workers usually hate their managers. So this is the 4 mechanisms very quickly summarized, right? Again, in the book there was much more texture on them. But so far, what this leads us to is 2 clear hypotheses, right, in terms of research design. One hypothesis is that firms with stakeholder alliances will be more likely to prevail in a conflict over property rights. And the second hypothesis is that they might be less likely to face such a conflict in the first place. Right? So in other words, the first hypothesis is about conflict resolution. The second hypothesis is about deterrence, right? So for the first hypothesis, I use case studies because it's where you can actually follow the mechanism very nicely. I also do case studies of failed conflict resolution. In other words, I'm not claiming that alliances always succeed, but it's also nice to examine failures to kind of pinpoint the boundary conditions for my argument. Now, you can't really observe deterrence as well, right? Because deterrence implies nothing happened in a way. So that's where a survey comes in handy, right? So this is where we're going from here. I will mention one case study in a little bit more depth. This is Olena, a producer of vegetable oil in Ukraine. Now, Olena had investments in corporate social responsibility on multiple levels, particularly when it comes to children. I mean, who would do anything evil to a firm with such a maternal logo, right? So I will tell you exactly who. So basically, it was local state actors in collision with Privat Group, which is a large oligarchic group in Ukraine. Suddenly, Olena, that never had problems with authorities, was swamped by multiple simultaneous lawsuits. So everything from environmental violations to a criminal case against the CEO, and everything in between, right? Suddenly, they just kept coming every day. They were receiving envelopes. And the real background to these kind of lawsuits was to expropriate a 60% equity stake in Olena that was legally sold in 2002. And basically, the attackers were trying to get their hands on that. They were trying to annul that sale, right, to make it seem as if that sale was not proper. So this was the ultimate goal. The idea was that the Privat Group would be the nominal owner, but the local state agents are the ones who would get a big cut of any future profits the firm would make. Right? This was kind of the setup. And I'm going a little fast. I have extra slides on expropriation schemes and how it actually works stage by stage. So if you're curious, we can go into that. That will definitely, if you were thought about investing in the region, this will be the last day you're thinking about it. Well, you still should, but you know, if you're an adrenaline junkie. Okay, so as I mentioned before, due to its prior efforts, Olena was blessed with a diverse range of stakeholders whose support it could draw on in the conflict. All right. So it had various labor supporting programs in the region. It had a variety of social initiatives. For example, it was famous for building these playgrounds, right, for children. And it also had the EBRD as a creditor, so the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. So when the problems started occurring, the Olena senior management, they basically have drawn on the different capacities of these stakeholders. So they held a press conference with the EBRD, with the director for Ukraine present, whom I interviewed for this case. This had a tremendous media response, both in Ukrainian and international newspapers. The workers of the enterprise rose to defend the owners, so they wrote an open letter to the Ukrainian president. And finally, Olena moved to make its community work visible. So all it did is it displayed these big banners on the playgrounds that simply said "Made by Olena," right? To simply telegraph to the people whom their welfare actually depends on, right? So, and with all this spotlight, basically it became clear that if the state agents proceeded with the expropriation, there would be retribution both at the voting booths come election season, as well as from Kiev in terms of administrative sanctions. Right? So very suddenly, all those lawsuits that were launched, all of them were closed within literally 10 days due to lack of evidence. So suddenly, they lost all the evidence for environmental violations and criminal case and regulatory violations and so forth and so forth. And the actual, one of the senior managers, his quote for this case is that we were worried that they would crush our gates with a KAMAZ. KAMAZ is a large Russian truck. And we strengthened our security, but that's not what saved us. And so in the end, the solution was really an issue of stakeholder alliances. Any questions so far? No? Good.
Could you, sorry, could you, and you may have done this before at the sort of break, how would you define a stakeholder alliance? Because it seems as though.
Such a good question, yeah.
No, but it's, I mean, it's everything from, you know, consumers to workers to actual stakeholders as we think of, so could you just provide a sort of a specific definition?
Absolutely, so the definition I use is stakeholders, it's a group that has an interest in the continued well-being of the firm and it's aware of that interest. So it is a pretty broad definition,
Yeah.
right? Because in practice, it is actually a very, you know, it subsumes a variety of actors. But it's not an alliance in the formal way.
Right.
Nobody signed a paper that said, I'm a member. This is not NATO, right, where you sign a paper. So this is not, yeah, it's more about a group of people who have an interest in common, and this interest happens to be keeping the firm as a going concern.
Consumers who want a mom and pop store to be able to continue to provide
Exactly,
low income,
exactly,
low cost products.
exactly,
Great, thank you
exactly.
very much.
And obviously you can think this through, and not at every level of benefits will the stakeholders actually rise to the occasion and protect the firm. Right? Only if and I'm staying within a purely material kind of rational choice framework here, but only if the level of benefits they receive is substantial enough for them to risk something, right? So you can kind of draw out the implications of that. Okay, so now this is actually the perfect time. Good. We're slowly transitioning to the survey evidence, right? And I have more kind of case studies in the background that we can go back to. Before we hit the survey, let's ask ourselves, how would you measure security of property rights? This is theoretically such an important concept, right, as we saw at the beginning. So there are 3 types of measurements that exist in the literature. These are the 3 types. So one is risk indices, right? These are these international organizations that basically claim to give you a ranking of countries based on their property rights security. Their methodology is very just non-transparent. I actually wrote to them and said, well, guys, do you mind sharing how you do this? And they don't share. So you just don't know. These are subjective expert opinions, I suppose. But obviously it should raise questions for any social scientist. Investment level, so behavioral proxy. The idea here is, look, we'll just look at how much the firm invests, and we'll assume the more it invests, the more secure its property rights are, right? The problem here is that investment is very multi-determined, right? It's not just driven by property rights security, it's driven by everything from marketing concerns to consumer market to whatever, right? To subjective things. So that's the trick here. It's also very hard to get the owners to honestly disclose how much they're investing, right? It's not that this data really just exists. You can look at it. The third way, and I think the most promising way, is business surveys, right? But here, the devil is in the details. So the World Bank has been doing these surveys for a long time, and in some of its questionnaires, they actually use the term property rights. In other words, they ask straightforward, how secure do you think your property rights are, whatever the specific formulation is. Now, I thought, okay, using the actual term property rights can be tricky because even among social scientists or economists, it's a pretty vague term. What exactly are property rights, right? What are the chances that all entrepreneurs agree on the same definition, right? And much less across countries, right? Different countries. So I actually tested the concept validity of the term property rights in my own survey. So I asked entrepreneurs in a semi-open-ended way, how do you define property rights? And I gave them 6 options, right? 3 of the options corresponded to our academic definition that we had at the beginning, so the rights to manage, transfer ownership, and derive income from. And the other 3 were kind of trick answers, right? So for example, access to finance. That's not a property right? You shouldn't be expecting to get a cheap loan just because your property rights are secure. But the fascinating thing is that only 16 to 23% of entrepreneurs define property rights in the way academics do, right? The Ukrainians did better on this. But the point is, we probably shouldn't be using that term in the surveys, right? So it's actually very important how you design your survey instruments. So we'll go a little faster through the next few slides, perhaps, so we have more time for Q&A. So the way I design my questions, and the later editions of the World Bank surveys does something similar, is that I ask about the threats, right? Rather than asking about security of property rights, I have a list of specific threats that I have from my informal field work in the region, right? So I know these threats occur on a regular basis, for example, extortion by taxation agencies, or illegal administrative barriers to obtaining licenses, and then I ask how serious these threats are on a 1 to 4 scale. So I get at the security by measuring the threat. And this is how it actually pans out. So this was already ordered in the descending order of magnitude. So the most severe one is extortion by taxation agencies, and the scores are for Russia and Ukraine between 1 to 4. Now, before I discuss so this is on the dependent variable, right? This is the outcome. And the independent variables are, of course, the alliances, right? And then a bunch of controls that could influence both the IV and the DB. Let's see. So this is maybe a little technical. Again, I will go a little quick here, but I'm happy to come back to this during the Q&A. What I do is, first of all, I use those preceding 9 threats as their own dependent variables, right? And basically run different ordered profit regressions. Then I use an average of all 9, and I call it property threat, and then I put it in 2 different buckets, the different threats. Top 3 are in the income threat bucket, and the other 6 are in the ownership threat bucket. And the idea here is that some threats are more detrimental than others. So imagine somebody just asking you for petty bribe to fast track your application. That's not necessary, that's not always bad, or you could at least imagine a scenario under which it actually smooths doing business. But there are also ownership threats that are much more unpredictable and potentially much more devastating. Right? So somebody actually trying to take away your firm, that's in no scenario is that a good scenario, right? So we can think about these 2 things as separate issues. These are the different independent variables. So let me just mention how I measure community and foreigners, because these are the measures for stakeholder alliances, so they're the more important ones. So the community support is a pretty straightforward question. How significant is the firm's support of regional community and labor, measured from 1 to 4? And I only code as 1 if the support is very significant. Because again, according to theory, it's only very significant transfer of benefits that should trigger support by stakeholders. The foreigners is pretty simple. It's basically if a firm has a foreign creditor or investor, I code that as a 1, right? Everything else is 0. And there are a bunch of dummies that control for everything from size to sector to ownership structure and to region. And the outcomes, so this is ordered probit first differences for the specific threats. So to translate this into English, stakeholder alliances with community and labor or with foreigners reduce 7 out of the 9 threats we had at a statistically significant level, right? So this is kind of the big bottom line. And the numbers here are actually meaningful. So this is already ordered probit coefficients transformed into what they call first differences through simulation. But basically you can read it as follows. Firms having alliances with community and labor are 46% more likely to report that they do not perceive any threat relating to illegal inspections. So this is the probability of reducing the threat completely, right? Everything else being equal, controlling all of the other stuff. Remember how I divided them into different buckets, ownership versus income, and everything together under property threat? So this is kind of pointing to that, the idea being that alliances have significantly reduced threats when they're all bunched together and averaged. When we separate them into the serious ones versus not so serious ones, it's interesting that they do significantly reduce the serious ones, but they don't have an impact on the less serious threats to income. And it can be an important distinction when we come to endogeneity issues, if we choose to go there during the Q&A. But the basic idea here is that if the firm is not really under threat, stakeholder, or under threat of changing ownership, right, or credible scenario where the firm is taken away completely, stakeholder alliances are not activated, right? This is, go ahead.
Clarification, the tax share variable?
Yeah.
It's tax owed to whoever the local bureaucratic government is, or is it just general tax owed to, say, the central authority?
Very good question. So this is a self-disclosed percentage of local taxes the firm pays in very rough brackets. So it's something like 0 to 5, 5 to 10, right? The idea here is that in some literature views paying taxes as having a protective effect. In other words, why would the state attack a firm if it pays a lot of taxes? But that's not what I find. But some of these proxies basically address key alternative hypotheses given the literature. Loyalty is basically about, well, why should I resist the state if I can join the state? Right? This is a very interesting question I had in the survey, where the firms were asked, how effective do you think are informal connections with state actors in reducing threats? Right? The idea here is that if a firm thinks it's effective, it will be also more likely to invest in those connections with the state actors. Right? And the reason I think both loyalty to the state and tax share are not significant is because we're dealing with predatory scenarios, where state actors are not thinking about the long-term horizon. Okay, I have to maximize taxes so that in 20 years my employment is up and I can build a bridge. Right? They're thinking about, okay, tomorrow I want to hire my cousin in the fire inspection agency so that we can squeeze this as much as we can in the next 2 years before hell knows what happens, and then we run. Right?
But just to be clear,
Yeah.
the actors were both a property threat and the actor who is collecting the tax are the same here because they're the local government.
Who is, from whom the threat emanates,
Yeah.
correct, absolutely, yes. But the difference is that formally collected taxes go into the treasury. Informal extortion goes into your own pocket, right? That's a very big difference.
But I guess the income threat versus the ownership threat, if they are being preyed upon for their income and they're accepting that, wouldn't that be what would protect their ownership? I mean, that's what a classic protection right is.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's really a big hypothesis here in loyalty. Well, here's why I think it doesn't work. Right, okay, so the idea is, why don't I just pay up a little bit instead of losing everything, right? That's kind of the idea. The problem, I think, is that this also assumes that the state actor has a sufficiently long-term horizon. In other words, do you guys know Olson, Menker Olson?
Yeah.
So he did some of this writing with the metaphors of stationary bandit versus roving bandit. So the idea is this, you know, some bandits, predators, whatever you call them, they try to plunder and maximize whatever they can take today. Some others try to establish a scheme for long-term. Okay, this seems like a good point at which I was trying to spare you a 2x2 matrix, but we might as well. This is Eric's fault. Okay. All right. All right. Are you ready? Okay. So, two distinctions I make. This is the larger conceptual scheme of my book, right? One distinction is between the type of rights that are threatened, income rights versus ownership rights. So basically, stationary bandits, in other words, state that has long-term horizons, they try to target income rights without targeting ownership. In other words, get a little bit from you every day for infinity, as opposed to take everything and then that's it, right? So that's this distinction. In the literature, think, again, stationary bandit, roving bandit. The second key distinction is whether the threats are organized or disorganized. And here, what do I mean by organized? I mean that it's controlled by the sovereign. In other words, it's one big pyramid, right? Putin knows, he approves, he gets a cut, something like that. Or the state as a whole functions as a revenue maximizing machine. If we think about the literature, there is a lot of literature on corruption that examines basically income threats that are organized or disorganized, particularly if you know Schleifer and Vishny classical treatment in '93. And there is a lot of literature on property rights that examines basically what I mentioned before about stationary bandit versus roving bandit, particularly North and Weingast, right? Classical literature there. And what I'm interested in is this quadrant, right? This is what I'm saying has been under-theorized. Threats that are disorganized, but at the same time, they're not limited just to milking the firm, right? They go much further, up to full destruction of the firm. And this is, I have these names for different types of threats, right? If you think about the metaphors, kind of skimming, just taking something from the top, leaving everything intact, siphoning, much more unpredictable in nature, but still leaves the ownership structure intact. This is Putin taking away Yukos, right? And that's Asian predation. And in terms of solutions, since we're on the slide, we might as well finish it. So this is where the literature is focused, right? Sovereign commitment, institutional constraints on the upper executive, right? Just think Orange Revolution 2004, you have independent parliament, things should be getting better, just like in medieval England, a la North and Weingast. But my argument is, okay, it doesn't take care of agent predation. Whatever it might do to sovereign expropriation, it doesn't take care of that. And this is where stakeholder alliances come into play. That was probably longer than your question was intended. But let me finish on your question, because your question, I don't think it completely answers it. So the reason you don't see these bribes as preventing something worse from happening is that what the bribes often do, they send a signal to the state, and the signal is you can be squeezed. Now, where's the boundary of that squeezing, right? If you give me something today, why not ask for more tomorrow, especially if my time horizons are not that long? Right, so this is where the trick occurs. I don't know if that makes. So the boundary condition for, well, under what's, because obviously we know that corruption in many cases does protect the firm, or at least seems to protect the firm. So the key boundary condition is political stability and state capacity. The more you have of that, the more reason state actors have to actually behave in practice like stationary bandits. as opposed to roving bandits. Does that make sense? But the key argument I make in the book is that too often we see the states as stationary when in effect they're actually roving, right? And the actual time horizons are much shorter, and I can show that. We can go into empirical slides, right? I can actually show that through subnational variation in predation, through those priorities of Putin, for example, that were undermined on the more qualitative side, right? We tend to overestimate, I think because we rely so much on kind of maybe economic models that see the state as this maximizing machine for investment and taxation. We tend to overestimate the degree of organization when it comes to predation and the length of time horizons that state actors possess. All right, so let me...
Just a
Yeah, go ahead.
follow-up.
Yeah.
For example, in Ukraine, does the government own every piece of land? Because that's the situation you're trying. Because if you own every piece of land, then you are much easier to just drive certain factories off the land. Basically, they can have ownership of the factory by the business owners.
Yeah.
Government even have the direct ownership of the land.
Right.
Government
Right.
make business much more involved. So just clarification.
So no, most of land in Russia and Ukraine, or a lot of land, has been privatized. And the cases I examine is not where the government owns the underlying land under...
I have to dispute that, I'm sorry. Most of the urban land that enterprises care about is still leased by local governments. And it varies greatly across Russia. Greatly. Moscow is 2%. It did have 2% until they expanded. Now it's 10% private owned. But that same phenomenon exists.
Right.
So if it's not privatized, there is huge privilege that the enterprise has that they have to be owned by the state.
Interesting. So in my cases, I have actually not observed this. This is fascinating, where the government would actually use the underlying lease.
Yes,
That's really interesting.
as a manipulation.
Yeah. So we should co-author something.
Yes,
Yeah.
I like that.
But generally, in terms of also conceptually, right? Conceptually thinking this through, there is a difference between property rights allocation and property rights security, right? So in my studies, I take private allocation as given, and I ask the subsequent question, okay, now that it has been privatized, is it secure or not, the property rights, right? Because the first wave of scholarship on post-communist countries has been about allocation, right? It used to be SOEs, now it's in private hands. And often people conceptually would think of of the security question as being derivative of allocation, right? Once you privatize, everything good follows, right? A lot of the early literature. And I kind of question that and ask, well, just because it's technically private on paper doesn't mean the rights are actually secure. Let's see. So we were here before, and it's just before wrapping up, so maybe I can wrap up and then we can go in depth on any issues that I mentioned or that I didn't mention, like UFOs or wherever you guys want to go. Okay, so we started our journey with the puzzle of how secure property rights emerge, right? And I have provided a theory that is sensitive to the context of weak states, which are defined not so much by state failure, right, or ruler dominance, but rather by rulers' incomplete control of state agents. And in such instances, I have argued the key threat to the entrepreneurs is not so much the way I put it in the book, not so much the bully in the penthouse, but more the termites in the basement. And the key solution is, this is the orthodoxy, if you will, right? The key threat is the powerful sovereign, and the key solution is macro-institutional design. Without denying the former, it obviously often matters, I draw attention to the local state agents as threats, and I point to firm-level strategy as a very important ingredient in the process of how property rights become secure. So where should we go from here? You tell me. So I have some slides on the big picture implications for rule of law. I have stuff on UCOS. We can go more into the oligarch story. Anything is up for grabs.
The oligarch.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah.
I don't know, the oligarchs looks very interesting.
All right, that's the sexy one, right? Let's do the oligarchs. Okay.
Sorry for being so.
Could I just ask a research design question? How did you comprise the list of companies that you surveyed? What was the selection that went into it? And did you specifically include firms that you knew had alliances? Did you take firms like IKEA that exited the country after giving up
Yeah.
and having huge local stakes? Were
Yeah.
these kind of companies included in your survey?
So the survey was conducted by 2 survey organizations that I hired for this project. They have a standard panel, a representative panel of firms for both Russia and Ukraine. So they're definitely not selected based on whether they have alliances or not.
Okay.
Also, these are domestic firms, so less IKEA and more Olena-like firms. They might have some investment by foreigners, but they're not MNCs expanding, and so that's just a different
Okay.
set of interesting questions, but not the one I addressed.
Okay.
Yeah, and the cool thing about the survey organizations I work with is that because they do this regularly, they have established trust with the owners of these companies. So the respondents are 92% executive management, and they're not afraid that somebody might be running a survey, say, from the government, or they care about, who knows what, because it's hard to make these people actually answer questions sufficiently honestly, right? So in that, I was pretty lucky. What the firms get out of it, they get summary statistics, right? Anonymized summary statistics, but they basically, at the end of each panel, they will know what their competitors think and how the climate actually looks like. That's what they get out of it. So thank you. No, you already, oligarchs, right, okay, oligarchs. Let's see. All right, where to start on the oligarchs? All right, why don't we start right here? So the key questions I ask in this big project on the oligarchs, there are 3 questions. First question is it fair or is it proper to think of the super wealthy as an interest group, right? Even this term oligarchs, we're like, oh, there is Putin and there are the oligarchs, right? Or there is, in Kiev, there are the Ukrainian oligarchs. We talk as if they were basically sitting around the table like ourselves here and deciding things and putting right? And part of my project, what it shows is that they're really not acting together in the sense that they are each other's worst enemy, right? And theoretically, the key problem is they can't commit to each other, because in countries that don't have the rule of law and where you have a lot of wealth, you can do anything you want. You can buy judicial decisions, right? Especially in countries like Ukraine, right? So it's very hard for them to develop trust towards each other. And in some of my work in Ukraine, I actually show after people become super wealthy, their networks fall apart. Right? So very often they act as their own individual agents as opposed to the oligarchs. I think a lot of Marxist literature would tend to view the super wealthy as a class, right? So I try to move a little bit away from that conception and just take instrumental power of individual oligarchs more seriously. The second point flows from the first. Okay, so now that we take the individuals here seriously, wealth defense is a term from Jeff Winters. He wrote a recent book on oligarchy. But which strategies should be more effective compared to each other? Strategies of wealth preservation. Right? So if you have basically, say, $1 billion in a country that's highly unstable and where the ruler could take it away tomorrow, what do you do politically? Do you run for office? Do you just send it to Switzerland? Do you establish a political party? Do you buy a media asset? I can actually give you the answer because I have the data set that has done that work. And the third question is, what are the consequences for democracy and rule of law of this extreme wealth stratification? Right, so this is very briefly. I will go a little fast here so that we can, but basically in terms of that second question, which strategies are more effective compared to others, I compare 3 things. First one is the so-called structural power. That is basically asset mobility, right? If you have more mobile assets, you can send, say, money as opposed to fixed capital that you can move between. Maybe you're more protected because you have asset mobility. On the instrumental side, so if you actually go into politics actively, 2 very different things you can do. You can run for office, right? Or you can support political parties indirectly or buy media assets, but without personally being in office. This distinction is pretty important according to the literature. So this is what we if we kind of read the literature, this is what we would assume. In countries that have the rule of law, like the United States, there is really no abiding reason why business people would go into power personally to protect wealth. All you need to do is donate a little to the Republicans, a little to the Democrats, sit back, watch the show, whoever wins, they owe you favors. That's kind of the idea, right? Very tricky model for countries that don't have the rule of law. If you donate today, tomorrow they win office and put you in jail. They don't owe you anything, right? They're not restricted by anything. So what do you do, right? So the literature tells us in countries that don't have the rule of law, the oligarchs have a direct incentive to actually be in office personally, right? That's conventional wisdom. Here I go through the data, hypotheses, and I guess I can, basically what I find, right? I can skip to the slide that has the findings, and then we can go back to some cool charts. What I find is that direct power is surprisingly ineffective. So being personally in office does not help the oligarchs preserve their wealth in countries that are politically competitive but don't have the rule of law. So this is Ukrainian data. Structural factors are ineffective, right? So just because somebody has more mobile assets or pays more taxes does not really protect you. What is off the charts effective are indirect strategies. Owning media assets and especially donating to parties. And actually reconceptualize the whole party support, because in countries like Ukraine, often it's not just donating to party, it's really creating a party from scratch. It's pretty phenomenal. So an oligarch, right, Kolomoisky, he started a party 3 weeks before the election. This is insane, right, in any kind of context we're used to. But these oligarchs, the amount of power they have, they can truly create a new party organization, pour so much money into it, it develops a credible media presence, and then it actually has a chance at the voting booth, right? And then they can extinguish that party later, right? So it's a whole different way of thinking what parties are, right? And the relationship between party leaders and sponsors. So that is in terms of a few very quick things on the oligarch project. We can talk more about more quantitative stuff. This is data from Ukraine. These are some of the top Ukrainian oligarchs. You might have heard of this guy. This is how their wealth has changed between 2006 and 2012. Another interesting thing I do, this is, by the way, 60% of the Ukrainian GDP, right, is the oligarchs' wealth, the top 100, and this is how it's invested across sectors. So you see a lot of presence in metallurgy and mining, but really pretty diversified all across. This is how it has changed over time. So here's an interesting thing. I ask, well, where did they get their wealth in the first place? Right? From what we read in the literature, we see this privatization a lot, right? So a lot of them became super wealthy because they participated in privatization. What I find is actually not the case for privatization. This is the size of the group. This is this axis, just the number of individuals. So the privatization cohort is actually not that big. Most of the Ukrainian oligarchs became super rich from scratch. From scratch meaning not in these other three ways. The other three ways being red director, so some of them had been directors of state-owned enterprises under the Soviet system. And during transition, they didn't have to participate in privatization. Often they could either sell the assets on the black market and derive a lot of wealth from that, or just keep running it as a director without formally owning it. And executive is more like the Western career you rise on the corporate ladder and so forth. But this is in terms of group size. When you look at their wealth, it's quite different. It's pretty interesting. This is the other axis. So even though the privatization oligarchs are pretty small, they're off the charts wealthy, right? So the median privatization oligarch in Ukraine is worth 700 million, compared from scratch 200 million, right? So this is just, the key point here conceptually is that we should move away from these generalizations like oligarchs, right? And we should really look a little bit more at data and take it seriously. And it helps us to theorize how material power is converted into political power, right? Here I look at whether the oligarchs who assumed office, whether they first had been state actors and then used their position to amass wealth, versus they first had been super rich and then used their money to go into office. It's a very interesting distinction. Basically, that's what I find. This is for people who have been super rich first. So think, in other words, Donald Trump or, say, Bloomberg in the US context. So billionaires first, then go into politics, so self-proclaimed billionaires. And business capture is the other way around. So in the US context, who was the governor of Illinois? Blagojevich. I don't know if anybody remembers Blagojevich. But this is a guy who was in power, not wealthy at all, and tried to use his office to amass wealth. And he ended up in jail in this country. Right? So this is often what happens to business captures in rule of law countries. When you move to the developing world, the picture is very different. It's a total staple of the developing world where you have a minister or even a mayor sometimes who comes into office as a relatively poor middle class individuals. And then within a year or two, they amass extreme wealth. Right? So it's a pretty interesting distinction I play with as well, just in terms of their relative wealth. Anyhow, so I hope that kind of answers a few things about my oligarchs project. But please feel free to ask more. Sorry, it was a long answer. Yeah.
A question about the role of state-owned enterprises. I got the impression it seemed almost as if there was this binary. State goes for a process of privatization. When someone had mentioned the China example, I was thinking, well, of course, this is a murky spectrum, right? And there could be expropriation issues, but there could also be certain benefits, right? You might get access to cheaper credit, political access, protection, and things like that. So I was wondering if there's a two-sided aspect of this. One, where on the spectrum, how does the spectrum of state-owned or influenced enterprises work post-privatization? And two, you're looking at the predation part, but are there potential benefits that aren't necessarily captured here for some of those companies? It may look like they're paying things off, but they're actually not just getting protection, a normal protection scheme, but they're actually getting things that might make them more successful in the long run.
Yeah. So there is no doubt that is also the case sometimes, right? So by no means do I say that in all the contexts I'm interested in, this is about predatory state focused on short-term benefits of expropriation, right? So, but the boundary between developmental, when we think about China, we often have this conception of somewhat developmental or benevolent sovereign, right? That boundary between quasi-developmental, let me put it this way, and quasi-predatory states has been much more work has been done on one side of the boundary than the other. Right? So we have done much more work on quasi-developmental states, what it means, how do enterprises develop connections that last, how do you build trust, how do you get state actors to co-invest with you. Some of the work in Africa goes in this direction, and so that everybody is on the same page. We tend to write off the issues of predation and corruption, I think, too easily, and that, it's just bad stuff, right? And that's where I think the value added of my work comes in. I show exactly what that bad stuff looks like, as well as the consequences it produces, both for firm behavior and stakeholder action, and also for longer term consequences. I mean, there I hypothesize, but an interesting question could be, okay, what about the rule of law proper? Right? These stakeholder alliances today, what kind of impact do they have on the rule of law proper? But this is just to say that by no means do I deny that even in Russia and Ukraine, right, in some cases, state-oriented strategy, in other words, paying state actors, creating, that's what I called loyalty in my survey, right? They help. But the data, I mean, this is the data speaking, right? Just like in terms of the data for Russia and Ukraine during my period, I can, based on representative survey data in my interviews, I can tell you that trying to establish connections with local state actors that are based on corruption is less effective in the long run than having strong stakeholder alliances against local predation. That's just, that's...
I'm afraid we run out of time, and there's another class that's moving into this room. So I do realize that there are more questions. Stan will be around, and we can hang out there if you want to ask your questions bilaterally. Otherwise, please join me in thanking